Okay, and we're live. Welcome back to the Meld PR vlog, everyone. If you are a long-time listener and a subscriber, thank you. If you're not, subscribe. Hit that like button. I like it.
But turn off the autoplay, right?
Turn off the autoplay. Yes. I am joined today by John Gray. It rhymes. My disinformation expert. Which actually, John, you're going to provide a little more context momentarily about exactly who you are and why people should be listening to you on this topic. But he is, in fact, my expert on this kind of a topic, which is great because today we're going to be talking a little bit more. It's a continuation of actually a few conversations about why people don't trust the media anymore. Why don't people trust the news? Just to give, just to give a little bit of context here, I just want to say this is going to be a longer conversation going into the causes. I want to get beyond superficialities. This is going to tie into, you're going to get my take as a PR and marketing guy and former news guy. And I also want to get John's take. John, why should people be listening to you about the topic of why people don't trust the news anymore?
Wow, thanks for putting me on the spot, Jonathan. Is this live or is it Memorex? I like Memorex. Dating myself. I guess, Jonathan, I think somewhat like you, I've got this, shall we say, lengthy experience and career in, going back to having done a communications degree back when Marshall McLuhan was still alive, and finishing a degree in communications when Neil Postman had just finished publishing Amusing Ourselves to Death. So I'm rooted in this world of I remember black and white TV. I remember a world before there were remote controls. So I have this analog thing. I still remember reading like newspapers and getting ink on my fingers. So it's been a really interesting sort of career trajectory, looking at media, looking at news, looking at all this through shall we say, a fairly long lens of a little bit of academic, a little bit of real world, having worked in radio, and a variety of really since I'd probably say 2001 through a pretty wide variety of technology type businesses, startup-y like businesses, some of my own business.
All right, John, I'm going to have
Yeah.
to ask you to fast forward 20 years. What are you
Okay.
doing today?
Today, yeah. What a long, I usually preface it right. It's like that, um, old Grateful Dead line, from from trucking, what a long, strange trip it's been. And honestly, I haven't taken anything yet today to, facilitate that weird trip. Yeah, look, so Jonathan, today, after, really since 2016, really starting to focus on this world. It started out, chasing bots on Twitter. I've grown up a little bit since then. Really looking at the whole information space with my Dr. Evil hat on every day, trying to think about, how the bad guys are trying to manipulate this information space, warp our sense of perception, twist realities. So today I'm officially, senior program manager for an organization called the DT Institute, based out of Washington, D.C. And my job is working with a really unique variety, portfolio of different organizations that are at the front lines of running different programs combating Russian disinformation. And a lot of it's pretty cool, working with some interesting independent media that are working in Belarus, working in Moldova. So yeah, it's been a really, really unique, shall we say, evolution of a career. So I've had a chance to talk to lots of people, get to know some really good people, and think a little bit about some of the crazy shenanigans going on in the space.
Excellent, excellent. So yeah, this is why I wanted to talk to you. I wanted to get this perspective of, why people don't trust the media from, your perspective of, how the Russians, the Belarusians, the Chinese, the Iranians, all these foreign bad actors, and it sounds like a James Bond movie,
Yes.
are changing up how we see our shared reality, and or we don't even have a shared reality anymore.
Yeah.
This is kind of the problem.
Yeah.
So before we get to the external factors that are messing up our brains and how we view the news, I wanted to just touch on the internal factors at play. And so I'm going to get into that. And for those, by the way, who are new to the Meld PR vlog and wondering why a PR and marketing wonk is talking about the intricacies of sort of media manipulation, manufacturing consent, and thinking, wait, aren't you just sort of undercutting your whole business model? Your whole thing is getting credibility for the most innovative companies out there, and so news is not credible. Well, how does this impact your business model? Not in a good way. So the point is, I feel like to address a problem, to solve it, you need to define the problem. You need to explain the problem. So this is a problem that affects both newsmakers and folks like me on the PR side. So this is why we're delving into this. Now, before we get into China, Belarus, and the data that you can bring to the table, let me first reference this Edelman poll, which is, we're not just talking about the bad trends in trust in media that have been apparent for decades. I'm referring to a specific poll. And it's called the Edelman poll, and it went out to, I believe it was initially shared just with Axios, but the findings have been shared more widely since then. And this poll it's called the,
Trust Barometer.
Thank you. The Trust Barometer 2021.
And they've been doing this now for basically 20 years.
Yes.
So it's not just a new thing.
Perfect. So some statistics I have cited previously: 56% of Americans agree with the statement, journalists and reporters are purposely trying to mislead people by saying things they know are false or gross exaggerations. 58% think that most news organizations are more concerned with supporting an ideology or political position than with informing the public. And so now the figures, this is about the US, but it's also about the larger world. The people from the people conducting the survey seem to be under the understanding that this was something that sort of predated Trump. Certainly trust in media has declined for decades. But I'm going to actually make a statement that I don't think should be controversial, in that if there is a public perception that the media is ideological and biased and is trying to manipulate, knowingly trying to manipulate how you see the world, because they are your filter into reality. If the public has that perception, maybe they're right. And maybe there are good reasons for this. Even before we get to the bots and governmental interference, I recall it was an editorial, I believe it was in the New Yorker, and this was back in and around 2015, 2016, either right before or right after Trump got elected. And it was an editorial essentially saying, in this era, we can no longer be objective. They just laid it out. I'm paraphrasing here, but their take was this is a time when we cannot simply play things down the middle. This is a direct threat to our democracy, and this is a political situation that demands a special kind of, well, he wouldn't have said slanted, but slanted coverage, which is what we saw over the ensuing number of years. I feel I should disclose at this time, once again, not a Trump supporter. I am again that guy who is the I abide by a shoe on the other foot rule, where if in fact the media was dominated by, let's say it was dominated by the right. Some people believe that to be the case. I don't think that to be the case. But if 99.9% of media coverage of, let's say, the current Biden administration was, he is a megalomaniac dictator, and bounce between that and he's a complete moron, and that was just saturation coverage all day, every day for the next 4 years, I would be against that too. Okay, are we on the same page that the media kind of, the public sees this because in fact, during the last 4 years, they're seeing something that actually happened.
Yeah, I guess sometimes, Jonathan, what I struggle is, this sort of recency bias, right? Like we're so in the now, we're
Right.
so in this moment that it just naturally seems like it. And then you throw in, obviously, today's media environment is different than 5 years ago, 10 years ago. But I think it's fair to say there's always been bias in media. I mean, I knew 20 years ago I could pick up one paper and I knew what I was getting from their slant, their perspective. I could pick up another one and the same thing, or I could turn on the TV. I was aware of, look, locally, you knew full well, even 20 years ago, 25 years ago, what you were going to hear on the CBC was not going to be necessarily what you would hear on global TV, right? So I don't think a lot of this is new, but I think, what we're obviously challenged with is scale, a tsunami of information. And, I look at this sort of more that what we really had is not simply an erosion in trust in media, and and again, using media broadly, right? Like I think there's a whole lot of different layers and kinds of media, obviously, and how we're consuming it, where we're getting it from. But I'll shift down to that. But I just feel like it really just well, there's no silver bullet solution to this conversation. It is complex. No kidding, Johnny. But I think, Joan, one of my challenges is today is it's the scale at which it is a tsunami of information. But my biggest concern is not so much that it's this erosion in trust of the media. It's actually the bigger issue for me is actually an erosion in our own epistemic grounding, right? Like an erosion of what is knowledge. I think that there's a failure collectively for a number of reasons that we're not getting beyond data, then to information. But there's a big failure in actually getting to that next leap of consuming a whole bunch of information. Where does knowledge come in? And then where does wisdom come in? Sorry, you sent a note of wisdom of the crowd. I don't think there is a wisdom of the crowd. I think it's the herd of the lowest common denominator today. So we can, I know you're chomping at the bit. So I mean, like I say, I look at this more so than just simply what's pouring out of the media and how the media is today. Like it's a really unique relationship, obviously, between a lot of elements of we, the consumer of information, and the information that we're being dealt.
Right. It's probably useful here to go into maybe a few examples of how ideological bias can maybe change a conversation or steer a conversation in a certain direction. So I don't know how detailed we want to get, but one example would be around reporting around the environment. So specifically here in Canada, talking about the oil sands, talking about pipelines. In the U.S., same deal. The Keystone Accord, the Keystone Pipeline. Recently, the U.S. walked out of the Paris Climate Accords. Now the new administration has walked them right back in. And actually, I think this is probably a great example. This one example. Of, if you're not tuned into the bias, you might realize, well, you might ask the question, why aren't reporters asking certain kinds of questions?
Sure.
So, I can't say that I've read every news report, watched every TV bit about the Biden administration rejoining the Paris Climate Accords. My general impression is that via how I get news through newsletters, through roundups, through social media, overwhelmingly, it's number one, this is done, fait accompli. There's no going back. It's a good thing. It was an utter mistake for the USA to leave the Paris Climate Accords. There's I've seen virtually no context. I don't think I don't think I saw any contextual pieces, possibly with the exception of what I've been reading in the Wall Street Journal about why the US left the climate accords in the first place. Why it might be a good thing to sign agreements that actually means something. So this would be, sort of an ideological thing of, we shouldn't be getting involved in agreements where there are no ways to enforce the agreement. We shouldn't be involved in agreements that appear to be virtue signaling to make people happy without actually being necessarily effective or addressing the problem. I haven't seen any of that kind of context. So what would you say to an example about that?
In all fairness, John, you just hit on the key word of this whole thing. Just even removing this as a conversation, that I don't want to come across as at all an expert in this space and get into a conversation of what I think of the accord, who's done what and why. But you hit on the key word, and I think this is, in terms of talking about this conversation about media, context. And through it all, whether we're talking misinformation, disinformation, overarching, I think that there's a real failure in journalism in terms of how we're looking at issues, in terms of presenting context of the issues. And I took that note because I also think now, with context, I see, and I'm not going to try to dig up examples, but there's no shortage of examples. So if we're lacking establishing context and framing, a fair perspective on a given argument, i.e. the pros and cons versus the Paris Accord, being in, being out, what about, in essence, twofold, both the consumers of information and those that are producing the information, the data around the stories that are being presented. So I think there's a huge amount of data ignorance as well as data manipulation. I think every day you could search through news headlines and find data taken grossly out of context. In all fairness, I have to plead, I didn't dig into the Edelman survey, but one thing I'm not seeing is, how big was the, all those questions around the survey and how we got to those percentages. And I think, again, this is part of, I think, being responsible in terms of being in this space. Isn't just taking somebody's press release and regurgitating it verbatim. I think we're not asking enough really hard questions and presenting that information back in a manner which, people are going to understand it. People are going to get it, and then ultimately people are going to make their own decisions based on that information.
Perfect. Great point. And so again, this is what I was getting to. I didn't want to get into a big thing about Paris Accord, good, bad. No, it's like how is the media presenting information? What are they focusing on? And actually, what kind of stories are pushing aside more important stories? So just to beat a dead horse here, the with the Paris Accord story, the most prominent story I saw about that in the wake of the Biden's administration's move to re-engage was a story around, it might have been a politician. I don't recall who it was about, but, and again, maybe this is just, the quality of the journalism. It just wasn't there for me. It was about, look at this silly person who thinks they're so important, and they think that they think that the Paris Climate Accord was created for the benefit of Parisians, for the benefit of people who live in the city of Paris. Oh. Look at this stupid idiot. And it's like, wait, why are we even talking about this? I don't know. Did you catch the same stories about this?
I did not.
Oh.
That sounds like somebody was sourcing Alex Jones.
Well, no, but this is exactly the problem is, why focus on, this tiny element of, number one, is this person important? Probably not. Let's say they are an important politician. Was that the actual point they were making? It wasn't actually clear from what they had written. And it wasn't also clear if she wasn't making a joke. So there's this other aspect to it. But yeah.
Like there's so many examples, I mean, I have one that, really, which congressman, I think from the, state of Louisiana suggested that, Ukraine invaded Georgia in 2008. Come on, man.
Yeah.
And I think, this is a problem, right? And I think going back to bigger issues around media rather than, diving into a lot of specifics is that, so yeah, there's always been problems in terms of, you think back to the notions of, controlling the means of production, right? Like there used to be a day where, the newspaper barons, right? That, they had the presses, they had the means of distribution, they had that, so we've seen, now, you and I are having this conversation. It's going to go onto a distribution channel and we don't need a broadcasting license. Right. So, but what we have had is an erosion of any sense of gatekeepers, right? So I guess I don't want to over-valorize the olden days because goodness only knows there were definitely, problems in terms of, how major media was, at times complicit, supporting Vietnam War maybe would be a good example. Hence, the Pentagon Papers was a, rather seminal moment in journalism, I think. But I guess where I'm at is that, is now it's like the wild freaking West.
Yeah. There
are no gatekeepers anymore because everybody can do it. And if everybody can do it, then what does it really mean? And, and just in my work, goodness only knows, I've spent a lot of time digging through some fairly questionable sources of information. Come on, people, if there's not even a byline attached to it, and then, if there is a byline, maybe take a minute to dig through it, actually see if it's a real person, And this is one of the challenges, right, Jonathan? And I've said this so many times. It's like way easier now to be entertained than it is to be informed. It is really hard to be informed today. How do we choose how to be informed? If all I'm looking at is alerts, hitting my phone and I'm literally forming my worldview around headlines, I'm actually not even reading the stories. Again, this is, we can't blame it all on click for cash business model, which goodness only knows it's the one big reason this is broken. Go
Yeah,
ahead.
it's no, that you've made some terrific points, which I completely agree with, and there's a lot to um, this. You know, we're in the 24/7 news cycle. We have this torrent of information. Who are the gatekeepers? In some ways, I'm actually perfectly okay with this, in the sense that I don't want there to be a designated curator who everybody 100% agrees is the ultimate source of
Well,
authority
but
on anything. We don't
there,
need high priests for our
there's never
information.
really been that though, Jonathan. I think that's one of my things is even
Mm,
back when we had the dominant, look, I still think, where are the Walter Cronkites today? There aren't any. Sean Hannity, 40 million a year? Come on, right? Like that's, sorry. Don't want to pick on one particular vein of news, but when I read Hannity's making like $40 million a year, that kind of tells me how, good things are. But it's I don't think there's always been gatekeepers. I think you can always look through a history of media. There's always been sort of that counter head, there's always been flyers, leaflets, there's always been counter forms of media
mm,
at any given moment. I mean, we're really lucky in some ways, being in this wild, wild west,
mm.
because if you think about it, I think about the people that have had to grow up on a steady diet of state propaganda, where maybe they are lucky if they can actually dial into like Radio Free Europe and actually, potentially hear other voices, like in a way, like, right now, for instance, there are two journalists that they've been imprisoned in Belarus now for it's now more than 60 days. They're facing significant jail time, and it's because they were doing their jobs as reporters.
Yeah.
We don't have that. And I think sometimes it's just because of what I've been doing and the type of organizations I've been working with. Like I look at this conversation, I go, there's a lot broken with our media, but at least, last I checked, there's no Canadian journalists in jail, for maybe wanting to cover an anti-mask rally at the art gallery, right?
Well, all right.
Um,
So this is where I'm going to push back a little bit.
okay.
So I completely agree with you. The government isn't jailing journalists yet, but the government and society in general seem to be um, doing many things that discourage certain types of journalism, covering certain types of stories from a certain angle. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the media landscape here. I'm going to make some generalizations that not everyone may agree with.
No, not
So
you.
I'm going
I've
to
never
say,
known you to do that.
yeah. I'm going to say that, number one, for any listeners in the US, Canada is effectively a colder California. We're largely a progressive country outside of, say, Alberta, which is basically Texas North. Yeah, if you looked at, say, our main, what we consider to be our mainstream media sources, the CBC, CTV, Global News, these kinds of things.
The Globe and Mail, National Post.
Yeah. Well, Globe and Mail, yes. So I would say largely a lefty bias, which affects what kind of stories they cover and how they cover them. The National Post, like the Wall Street Journal, it's like one of the few sort of respectable publications that seems to still retain respect, even from people who don't necessarily agree with most of what gets written in it. And then
Some of the opinion.
yes, and then you have this bizarre strain around the Rebel News,
Yeah.
which is an outlet that came out, I want to say 5-6 years ago. Maybe it's more recent than that, headed by Ezra Levant, who I don't have a survey of this, but every journalist, every working journalist I've spoken to, if this has come up in a conversation, if the Rebel ever comes up, there's like this instinctive, oh, but they're not journalists. That's not news. And I sort of go back to first principles. A journalist is someone who is going to gather facts, research, interview people, tell stories, get that news out. If it's biased or not, yeah, we know there will be a bias, and then of course we know what ideological spectrum the you know, the rebel in particular comes from. Obviously, they're right wing, but you know, for a large segment of the population, you know, anything to the right of CBC, the Globe and Mail, Maclean's. These are, anything to the right of that is far right, and so you get to the utter ridiculous position of people claiming that an organization headed by a Jewish lawyer who talks about Western democracy and free speech every 5 minutes is a Nazi. That guy is a fascist, or they'll use wiggle room language, crypto fascist. It's secretly they're dog whistling. So of course this extends to other forms of media. So my point is, you were saying Canada doesn't jail journalists. No, the journalists who would be reporting from a certain biased from the right side, they don't become journalists. They become accountants. They become engineers. They become business owners. They go into a somewhere else they can spend their lives meaningfully and won't get their ass kicked every single day and accused of all kinds of horrible things.
I think that's, you know, sorry, bud. I mean, look, I get where you're going with that. I mean, I think that's, you know, special to our media environment in Canada. It's funny, I took a note here, you know, just sort of went, you know, because I wanted to talk about sort of the notion of some standards, which, you know, you did talk about. So, you know, and just, I will just take a little, I get what you're saying. So it's, in a way, it's a form of self-censorship. It's a way of, like, you know, darn, you know, if you fall into that spectrum, you are going to potentially get mobbed. You're, you know, those are all qualities which are, you know, most unbecoming. And I do feel badly for the Jonathon Kays, the Terry Glavins, and some really strong voices that are prepared to call some of the bullshit. But, you know, look, Jonathon, it's not like being beaten. It's not like having your camera broken, confiscated. And it's not like sitting in a Belarusian jail. And I'm happy to share a story as somebody that I know that actually spent 15 days, you know, in jail and then spirited out of the country. And so I just think that, you know, like, just, you know, just don't want to say, I think we got it pretty good in this country. You can still, you can still say, you can still report, you can still, you know, Rebel Media has not been shut down. We could still, if you wanted right now, I'm pretty sure we could go find their website, and, you know, the government of Canada thankfully hasn't yet, you know, blocked access to Rebel Media.
No, they just sue them, and they're the one organization that is not allowed in the Canadian legislature as reporters. So they sue them. They bar them from talking to actual journalists so that they're not able to ask their hard questions. And again, I 100% agree with you. This is not comparable to what goes on in Russia or other parts of Eastern Europe or China or Turkey, where you know, you get hundreds, thousands of journalists jailed, some assassinated. It's like, that is bonkers. I'm saying that you know, we have a kindler, gentler version of censorship, which, you know, we don't physically destroy people. But there is pressure brought to bear that is insidious and tyrannical, but it's a few layers down.
Okay. You know, it's interesting because, you know, I wanted to go back to the issue of context. And, as you might have remembered, I was commissioned actually to do some research with my former business. Did some research over the course of about 5 weeks in the lead up to the Alberta election. Thought was a pretty good precursor to the 2000, God, I'm losing track of time. I think it was the 2019 Canadian election. So what was really interesting is after, I did the research, found some fairly, and this is strictly focused on behavior on Twitter related to a number of specific hashtags related to the upcoming Alberta election. I found some really disconcerting patterns and forms of behavior, and the organization that commissioned me to do the research, then passed it along to some media outlets. I was subsequently interviewed by a number of the media outlets. And it just, no matter how hard I tried to basically tell each one of the journalists, and this was from a spectrum of journalists, that I'm not talking about bots here. I'm talking about, I call it synthetic behavior, because in a lot of cases, there was no way I could actually say that this was for sure a bot, but I saw enough questionable behavior that was concerning. But yet every one of those journalists, from Press Progress to global media, their headlines were all started out talking about how many bots there were. And I went to great lengths with each one of them in every one of their interviews. And if you went back to the interview notes, you would see that I basically said, I'm not saying this is bots. And so, that's just an issue of, again, I think being on the other side of that, not being the journalist, but being that guy who's being interviewed by the journalist and still seeing, my work taken out of context and the story twisted to meet a certain, shall we say, journalistic need of the day.
Well, John, I'm not going to take you out of context, and I'm giving you the full opportunity to explain exactly what you mean. What do you mean these? I assume you're talking about foreign interests, whether this is nations or...
I just wanted to use this as an example, Jonathan, not dive down that specific rabbit hole around that. That ship has sailed. It was just a really interesting exercise, and in essence, doing some research. I can stand by the quality of research and the methods we use to do that research. It's always nice to get paid for that research. But ultimately, like I said, my issue was how right across the board, I think I was probably interviewed and published around this research by 6 different media outlets. And each time it was basically taken out of context.
Can you get... okay, so so we're closing this off, this point off, and I know you didn't want this to dominate the discussion, but I'm just, what were the other kinds of things that you were hoping that the reporters would focus on beyond the bots in terms of...
Well, that was just it. It wasn't, I actually even was clear in the research. This isn't about talking about bots. This is talking about, like I say, synthetic questionable behavior. Potentially astroturfing. It was trying to get beyond a conversation of making it about, it's about bots and automated behavior. It was just basically having a conversation this is the form of behavior I saw. This was really disconcerting. But what's really interesting is I can flip that experience, is that I still believe there still is a bar out there somewhat. It has been totally thrown out in terms of quality journalism. And that was in 2018, I had an opportunity do some research and work with Steve Stecklow at Reuters, based in London, and did some research on behalf of his work he was doing around basically the issue in Myanmar at the time, around the Rohingya being, shall we say, expelled. And it was a pretty amazing experience, because the data that I got from him, and in all fairness, it was the first time I can relate to actually, people talking about journalists and sort of having a bit of, sort of PTSD, because when I was going through the data and some of the images and things that I was seeing via Twitter, it was really disconcerting. Kind of forgot how heinous human beings can beat other human beings. It was a really sobering exercise. But my point is, Jonathan, is working with Reuters or working with their team, the bar at which and how it was set to actually verify and to publish the work that I did as part of this piece. It was called Hate Book. And it was part of actually a 9-part series that ultimately won the 2019 Pulitzer Prize for international reporting. So from my little perch working on that project, the bar that was set for the work that I did to end up in that article, number of passes it went through, basically their editorial process to their legal process, it gave me actual hope that there is still real journalism being done today.
Right. So, sorry, can we delve a little bit deeper into this? And we should probably define, for those who aren't maybe so familiar with what goes on in Myanmar and who the Rohingya Muslims are, can you provide a little context of what precisely was being investigated? What is the context on the ground? And then how this is an example of media manipulation or ideological bias and getting away from that to get to a real story.
So, I guess part of it, Jonathan, I was trying to keep this at a high level, just to talk about journalism and standards of journalism and what I experienced personally, versus actually down into the nitty gritty of going into the geopolitical issue in 2017, 2018, in terms of the persecution of the Rohingya in Myanmar, the amount of violence, the hundreds of thousands that were displaced by the military regime. It was, hey, like I said, Myanmar burning, Google it, Reuters. Like I said, it's a revealing 9-part series on everything you need to know and want to know about what's going on in Myanmar.
Right. So I've been looking at this. In fact, I think I was writing about this 8 or 10 years ago. So I'm familiar with it. So, I mean, big picture, it's a story of persecution, ethnic cleansing, genocide. At least that's what it seems to be on the ground. Multiple players, and effectively a junta, a military government that, and I know that there's been changes in the government in recent years, but it's not exactly a beacon of democracy to the world. And so in this case, I gather the story here is that maybe the government was trying to downplay or hide stories about persecution. Like what was,
again, like I say, John, I only had a real small piece, and I was looking at it from one of the I was a sidebar story of one of the 9 stories, and the overarching story was looking at that I worked with journalism. Is he was looking at specifically the role that Facebook played in their failure to acknowledge the activity that was going on Facebook that was basically helping drive a lot of the hate towards the Rohingya. And a lot of that actually came down to the fact that the ability to translate the language, there was a huge failing on Facebook's part in their ability to actually translate and detect the language that was being used, which, through Facebook, which was a very key part of the messaging that was going on that helped perpetrate a lot of the violence, or at least contribute to it. So it was a really interesting story in that regards. And ultimately, I was given the opportunity, he found me to share some data that they'd received from Twitter, and he asked me to do that analysis just to suggest that this wasn't strictly a Facebook problem, but there was also some interesting dynamics unfolding in terms of Twitter. So that was the role that I played in doing that reporting.
Right.
But, like I said, it's just from a personal point, is that, really what I wanted to make is that, it's so easy at times to look at the state of journalism today and wonder, where are the standards, what are the, what is the bar for doing journalism? And there's still one out there. And I just felt like, I wanted to share with you that I experienced that firsthand, just in terms of the amount of back and forth that I did with this journalist and with the team at Reuters
Right.
to have this small bit of research published. It was really it was a really impressive exercise. It just wasn't, oh, thanks, John, here, and boom, it's published.
Yeah. So I think that's a really good point. And I don't want to give the impression that because this topic keeps coming up on this podcast, that in fact, I personally have a low regard to the point of, assuming all journalists are fake controlled. At best, they're unknowing accomplices. At worst, they are activist ideologues who are putting forth facts that support their position and playing hide the, hiding the facts that disagree with their position.
Yeah.
I don't think that's. I don't think that's the case with many journalists. I actually don't know. I couldn't even guess at the number of journalists who are utterly compromised at this point. Either, again, they're useful idiots, or they are willingly, knowingly propagandizing for whatever the side is.
But I think it's like every
Yeah.
thing. Jonathan, come on. I mean, look, it's like there's good, there's lousy accountants, so like there's going to be good journalists that get up every day that care. But again, it's not just the journalists, at times, well, not being a total like grammar, obviously, or punctuation guy, but holy mackerel, the standards of editors these days, I really do at times have to wonder. So I think it's not just focusing on the journalists, and if you come back to the business model, who gets to call themselves a journalist, who's actually and again, I don't want to overvalorize necessarily going to journalism school, but if everybody can do it, then is it good? And so I mean, so I think I have to look at this. There's sort of this, I think, almost like a hierarchy of media to a degree, and those that have resources that utilize the resources, I think, with a modicum of respect for factual, trying to get it right, not always getting it right, but right through the chain, from basically the junior reporters to the senior reporters to the editors to right through the whole chain of the business of producing news. When there's accountability, when there's people that actually are trying to be professionals, I think we still have to respect that. That we have to respect that. But my thing comes back to is that it's the overall media ecosystem. There's Facebook isn't the news. You just kind of happen to get some news potentially delivered to you, micro-targeted from other sources, right? So I mean, I think what we have to be careful of is at times is not just having this sort of big blob and amorphous sense of just this one media, right?
Of course.
So it's like making comparisons, yes, in Canada, and I'm not going to claim I'm a fan, but we know what we're getting from the CBC. But can we put Canada Land on the same standard of journalism as what CBC is? I don't know.
Are you talking about a low standard for?
Well, what I'm
sorry,
saying
I'm not.
Is it a fair comparison?
Yeah.
Is it a comparison we can even make?
So yeah, just to be clear here, as much as I love getting CBC coverage for clients, in terms of the actual news value of what has been coming out of the CBC, that's been declining for decades. I guess I would put it like this. I've read, I'm not an expert in Canada Land. I've probably read, I don't know, maybe at most a few dozen stories out of there, or listened to their pieces. And Is it better than CBC? Maybe not. Is it worse?
And look, and there's also no direct
Yeah.
correlation between resources and the quality of what comes out, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
just because I have a sausage factory doesn't mean I make good sausage, right?
Yeah, yeah. Let me zero in on for people who are having difficulty understanding how an ideological bias might impact certain stories. I wanted to get back to a specific example, which I think might be the best example of the last, I don't know how many years, was the coverage of, well, on the one hand, you have a certain group of people who believe that over the summer, over the summer and early fall in the United States, there were 4 months of riots happening in cities across the USA. This is a story that you would think would be hard to hide. And then you have those who, like I was literally, I didn't want to make a direct comparison, but when the assault on the Capitol by nutcases was happening in the U.S. recently, I was, and they were talking about the response to this from the military and the cops, and I just made the point not to put the two things on the same level, but to say, where was the hard response with the riots that happened in Portland and in New York and in I think it was Minneapolis. I may be getting the cities wrong, but neighborhoods were destroyed, hundreds of millions of dollars worth of property damage done. And so I asked this person, what do you think about that? And they're like, what riots? What riots? What are you talking about? And I just thought, wow, okay, so we literally are in not a shared reality, because you remember the chyron on CNN of mostly peaceful protests with the reporter standing in front of a neighborhood burning behind him, and talking about, oh yeah, this either this seems to be a peaceful protest or it's a mostly peaceful protest. There was this insanity around this mostly peaceful thing, which got memed to the nth degree, where you'd have the essence of it was serial killers are 99.9% peaceful. They're mostly peaceful until they actually murder someone. The drunk driver who ran over your favorite aunt, they were mostly peaceful until they did that. And it's like, okay, can we recognize a reality where we should be reporting on there should be certain standards of what is an important story, and let's not try to sort of spin certain things in crazy ways. What are your thoughts?
Oh, thanks for giving me some advance, warning on this subject. I actually tried to think how I was going to come up with a cogent response, and I'll just kind of go back to I felt like, I guess, some of the news I was consuming over those 4 months, I didn't feel like I was hidden from the fact that there wasn't looting, there wasn't violence, there wasn't destroyed neighborhoods, and that there was no question in some cases peaceful protests certainly didn't look terribly peaceful. And trust me, I'm not a subscriber to Breitbart, so look, yeah, what happened on January 6th,
I think we both can agree, was insane and illegal and terrible.
Yeah. Yeah, what part of just here, let's pour a lot of gas on the thing and throw them at.
Yeah, well,
yeah, man, like, I don't know, Jonathan, like, these are such, like, I guess, again, we can come back and we can, if we go back to the premise of this conversation, we can go look at the Edelman Trust Index, and we can say that, 56% of Americans agree with this statement. I have a funny feeling that, this isn't necessarily new. We can agree that the trust in media has been eroding, but I think we can always agree that there's always been a polarity when it comes to, what newspaper you read versus what newspaper maybe I think that we've always had this. It's just that, now we are being exposed to certain events which I hope make us collectively step back and realize really how fragile democracy is.
Yes.
So I think regardless of what we were talking about, I think actually both incidents from the summer to January 6th, I think regardless of how we look at how they were reported, I think are both really strong indicators of we just can't take democracy and liberal democratic values for granted.
Yeah.
I think we really have to step up and ask us really hard questions about, the nature of the kleptocratic practices.
Yeah.
I think we have to, really step back and start asking ourselves some really hard questions. And I think it's going to emerge, continue to emerge significantly as this current pandemic continues to, be an issue in all of our lives. Look, we really need to start talking about some of the inequities. The difference between the haves and have-nots. And I felt like one of the things we didn't touch on, and I touched on it earlier, was the notion of the erode. Like this is an epistemic crisis, right? That this is a crisis of knowledge. If we can't have a notion of like, if we have a world of alternative facts, how can we have agreed to shared ideas of knowledge and shared truths? And those things that, there's things that we don't have to agree on, but there's a few things I think we should, more of us, try to agree on. And above all, I think one of the things that we've really seen is an erosion, like we've forgotten how to actually disagree with each other. But, I think, Jonathan, like one of the things, and I'm just being mindful of the time here, is that, we've actually fallen into these almost traps of confusing news and opinion. If we can't differentiate news and opinion, if we can't differentiate news from satire, this world of infotainment. And I think one of the things that we don't have a serious enough conversation about socially, and it really kind of gets me a little riled up, as you can tell some things do. I think we have a real significant literacy issue in North America. Like best research I could do went back to, it was probably 2014, but they estimate in the United States, over 30% of the adults in the United States are functionally illiterate. So we can take that number and realistically, I think, superimpose it upon our country. We can probably superimpose that on Great Britain. We could probably pull that number right across. And so I think actually, unless we really, as citizens, start pushing harder to elevate the overall literacy rates in our respective countries, I don't think some of these problems are going to go away anytime soon. You talk about memes. I call it mimetic warfare. And that's actually a really understudied part of the world that I'm operating in. I'm really concerned about the power that memes have as related to low literacy rates, because those are really easy to consume and inform my worldview. So yeah, that's just one more little rant from me.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I'm cognizant of the time as well. Do you have a few more minutes?
I feel like, I'm
Okay.
on the verge of having a stroke. No. Jonathan, I always love these conversations with you, but I'm actually more concerned about
Yeah.
maybe some of your listeners having a stroke, having to listen to
Oh,
us go on much longer.
well, I did want to touch on one final thing, which is an
One
area
more thing.
which is an area where you do have some expertise, and this is again around international actors having an effect on our discourse, and specifically news agencies like RT,
Yeah.
Russian TV. I believe it's called Press TV, is the Iranian one. There's Al Jazeera, and I heard from not a few. I think it was two or three of my associates who just volunteered a few years back that their go-to news source was Al Jazeera because it just plays it straight down the middle, and or words to that effect. And I'm curious if you have any thoughts about these these news agencies that are sponsored by certainly undemocratic or even countries that actually hate democratic Western countries. I wonder if you had some thoughts about how effective they have been.
Well, there's my thoughts. So at least, in the US,
Mm,
RT's got to be registered as a foreign agent.
mm,
Even though our little policy paper, a piece I worked on last year,
mm.
has yet to be publicized. I've made the point. I believe that in Canada, um, all of the state broadcasters that are pouring into our media ecosystem,
Mm,
China, Iran, Russia,
mm.
all of them should be labeled as, foreign agents.
Yeah.
We just can't continue to allow those strategic narratives to keep playing
Yes.
out to, really pollute and corrupt our information space
Right.
with
Right.
impunity.
So,
And so, at the very least, the Canadian government's got to act, and I don't
yeah.
think we're taking that seriously enough.
Yeah. Well, the reason I bring it up actually is most recently, I think it was 2 days ago, I saw a friend of mine who he's also a right-leaning dude, but he threw in a link to an RT thing that supported his position, and I'm just like from my stance, I would just never use RT as a source for anything. Just I feel like it would undermine my credibility. And this goes to people just sort of staking out a position, and then I'm just going to find a fact from wherever that
That's like
supports
saying
my ideological
That's like
position.
saying Global Research is a credible
Yeah.
Canadian media producer.
Yeah.
Then the fact, I got to be
Mm,
careful about some of the things I,
mm,
potentially lob out there because
mm,
it's pure speculation. So I won't go down the path. But Global Research, I mean, that's a cancer.
mm,
It has been operating in a long time. Just because he's a sort of retired University of Ottawa academic,
mm,
Michael, I can't pronounce his last name.
mm.
Yeah. I see you. I see those eyebrows, John. You're going,
I no, I'm unfamiliar with this.
oh, well,
I
that'll be a
don't.
whole other conversation another day. We'll talk about global research.
Okay.
Um, Campbell Clark from the Globe and Mail's actually done some good digging
Mm,
into the world of global research and how they are, and they've been tied, by the very good study that the Global Engagement Center with the
mhm,
U.S. State Department put out. Actually, tied global research as being an official actor as part of the Russian disinformation
mm,
ecosystem.
mm,
So that's just homegrown talent, dude.
mm.
So yeah, look, Jonathon, like you, if I had a friend, using RT as a source, I would quietly take him aside and maybe take him
Yeah.
up behind the woodshed and give him a good whooping.
Yeah, not good.
Not good.
So
Not good.
if you know who you are, if you're watching this, stop it.
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Yes.
Thank you, John. You've been very generous with your time. I've been speaking with John Gray. about why and how people don't trust the media anymore, and some steps we can take to get around this challenge and maybe dig ourselves out of this hole. John, if somebody wanted to find you, how would they do
No,
so?
I don't want to be found. This is me popping my head up. I'm really enjoying just kind of keeping my head down and working. But, you know, you're such a persuasive guy. And, you know, like I said, Jonathon, I really appreciate the effort. And you know, look, if you want to put it in show notes, you know, sure, I do tweet a little.
Okay, you'll be
And I'm on
my
LinkedIn. That's about it. And my outflow of social engagement is pretty low these days.
okay. That's fair. I'm gonna mark you down as John Gray, International Man of Mystery, in the show notes. And at that point, and just wait for the Barbara Streisand effect to kick in, and suddenly you'll be, you know, just.
Look, if somebody shows up and they say I've got
Yeah.
billions, you know, I'll listen.
Yeah.
You know.
Okay,
Thanks,
John.
man.
It has been a pleasure. You've been listening to the Meld PR vlog, and I'm your host, Jonathon Narvey. If you haven't already clicked like, because this was such an awesome show, please do so. Please subscribe. We're trying to get up to 1,000, and then we'll get up to 10,000, and then soon we will own the internet. Thank you very much for your time. Take care.